गोपीचन वल्लभा गिरिवरधारी यशोदानंदन व्रज जनरंजन यशोदानंदन व्रज जनरंजन यमुना तीरा वनचारी यमुना तीरा वनचारी जय राधा माधव कुंज बिहारी जय राधा माधव कुंज बिहारी जय गोपीचन वल्लभा गिरिवरधारी जय गोपीचन वल्लभा गिरिवरधारी यशोदानंदन व्रज जनरंजन यशोदानंदन व्रज जनरंजन यमुना तीरा वनचारी यमुना तीरा वनचारी जय राधा माधव कुंज बिहारी हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्ण कृष्ण हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम राम हरे 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 कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम राम हरे 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 कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे हरे जय प्रभुपादा जय प्रभुपादा शील प्रभुपादा जय प्रभुपादा शील प्रभुपादा जय ओम विष्णुपाद परमहंस परमहंस अष्टोत्तर सदस्य श्रीमद ईश्वरीय श्री भक्तिवेदांत स्वामी शील प्रभुपाद की जय। इस्कॉन संस्थापक जय शील प्रभुपाद की जय। जय ओम विष्णुपाद परमहंस परमहंस अष्टोत्तर सदस्य श्रीमद भक्ति सिद्धांत सरस्वती गोस्वामी महाराज प्रभुपाद की जय। जय ओम विष्णुपाद लखोर किशोरदास बाबा महाराज की जय। जय ओम विष्णुपाद सच्चिदानंद श्री भक्ति विनोद ठाकुर की जय। जय ओम विष्णुपाद वैष्णव सार्वभौम श्री जगन्नाथ दास बाबा महाराज की जय। जय श्री रूप चंद्र भट्ट रघुनाथ श्री जी गोपाल भट्टदास अविनाश गोस्वामी प्रभु की जय। नमाचार्य दास ठाकुर की जय। प्रेम से कहो श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्री गौर भक्तवृंद की जय। श्री श्री राधा कृष्ण को गोकुल श्याम कुंड राधा कुंड की गोवर्धन की जय। श्री श्री गौरांगी बैंगलोरीश्वर भगवान की जय। श्री मायापुर धाम की जय। श्री वृंदावन धाम की जय। अंक माई की जय। यमुना माई की जय। भक्ति देवी की जय। तुलसी देवी की जय। अनंत कोटि वैष्णव की जय। श्री हरनाम संकीर्तन की जय। ग्रंथराज श्रीमद भागवतम की जय। इस्कॉन वर्तमान गुरुवंद की जय। समागम भक्तवृंद की जय। गौर प्रेमानंद देव हरि हरि बोल। All glories to the assembly. All glories to the assembly. All glories to the assembly. All glories to Shri Guru and Shri Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswati Vyasam Tato Jayamudire Nashtaprayeshu Bhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Uttama Sloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtihi. Hare Krishna. So we're reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 24, Text 42. Vratam sa astito maunham atmaika sharno munihi nissango vicharat kshonhim anagnir aniketanaha. Vratam sa astito maunham atmaika sharno munihi nissango vicharat kshonhim anagnir aniketanaha. Vratam cha astito maunham atmaika sharno munihi nissango vicharat kshonhim anagnir aniketanaha. Translation Srila Prabhupada ki jai. The sage Kardama accepted silence as a vow in order to think of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and take shelter of him exclusively. Without association, he traveled over the surface of the globe as a sannyasi, devoid of any relationship with fire or shelter. Here the words Anagnir Aniketanaha are very significant. A sannyasi should be completely detached from fire and any residential quarters. A grihastha has a relationship with fire either for offering sacrifices or for cooking, but a sannyasi is free from these two responsibilities. He does not have to cook or offer fire for sacrifice because he is always engaged in Krishna consciousness. Therefore, he has already accomplished all ritualistic performances of religion. Aniketanaha means without lodging. He should not have his own house, but should depend completely on the Supreme Lord for his food and lodging. He should travel. Mauna means silence. Unless one becomes silent, he cannot think completely about the pastimes and activities of the Lord. It is not that because one is a fool and cannot speak nicely, he therefore takes the vow of Mauna. Rather, one becomes silent so that people will not disturb him. It is said by Chanakya Pandita that a rascal appears very intelligent as long as he does not speak. But speaking is the test. The so-called silence of a silent impersonalist Swami indicates that he has nothing to say. He simply wants to beg. But the silence adopted by Karda Muni was not like that. He became silent for relief from nonsensical talk. One is called a Muni when he remains grave and does not talk nonsense. Maharaja Ambrisha set a very good example. Whenever he spoke about the pastimes of the Lord. Mauna necessitates refraining from nonsensical talking and engaging the talking facility in the pastimes of the Lord. In that way, one can chant and hear about the Lord in order to perfect his life. Vratam means that one should take a vow, as explained in Bhagavad Gita, amanitvam adambitvam, without hankering for personal respect and without being proud of one's material position. Ahimsa means not being violent. There are 18 processes for attaining knowledge and perfection, and by his vow, Kardamuni adopted all the principles of self-realization. Om Akyanti Virandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurvaitam Mena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupakada Mahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Padakamalam Shri Guru Vaishnavamsya Shirupam Sankrijatam Sagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sujeevam Satvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sagana Lalita Shri Vishakantitamscha Ye Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostade Taptakanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vishubhanusute Devi Pranamami Haripriye Pancha Kalpatarubhyascha Vasnudubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavnebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Namo Om Vishnupada Krishna Bhastar Bhutare Srimad Bhaktivedanta Swami Namne Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Parchane Nirvishesha Shunnyavadi Paschatya Desadharne Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Muham Karadu Vachalam Pankablam Devyam Yakapada Muhammad Shri Gurum Dentadna Paramatman Shri Chaitanya Mishra. Hare Krishna. So welcome you all to this Friday morning Srimad Bhagavatam class. So in this verse today, it is mentioned as to how Kardamuni accepted silence as a vow to think of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and take shelter of Him exclusively. And without association, he traveled over the surface of the globe as a sannyasi, devoid of any relationship with fire or shelter. So there is a specific mention of a sannyasi, what he should do, what he should not do. So a sannyasi should be completely detached. In this particular verse mentioned as to how he should be detached from fire and any residential quarters. So a sannyasi is not supposed to cook. He's supposed to live by begging alms. And the grihasthas are supposed to offer sacrifices in the fire, 5 sacrifices. But a sannyasi is not allowed to do 5 sacrifices also. And another important point is that a sannyasi is not supposed to have any residential quarters. So he should be free completely from all of these and depend fully on the Supreme Lord for his both food and for his lodging. So he should travel. So sannyasi is a stage, is the last of the 4 ashramas. It is brahmachari, grihastha, vanaprastha and sannyasi. At that stage, one should be fully surrendered unto the Supreme Lord, depending on the Lord for his sustenance. You should not stay in one place also, because staying in one place, one becomes attached to that place. It is said that one should stay only for one night under a tree. Of course, this may not be practically possible these days, but the point, the essence of that is that one should not become attached to eating or staying in one place. So, in the 7th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, some duties of a sannyasi are given, which we will try to go through as much as possible. A person able to cultivate spiritual knowledge should renounce all material connections and merely keeping the body inhabitable. He should travel from one place to another, passing only one night in each village. So this was the system that was prevailing those days. Sannyasis never used to or renounced order personalities. They never used to stay in one place beyond one night. They used to travel from one village to the another. And they renounce all the material connections, anything related to the body. They renounce everything, because that is a renunciation, not artificial renunciation, but one should be renounced as much as possible from this material world. So in this way, without dependence in regard to the needs of the body, they should travel all over the world. So sannyasis used to travel all over by walk. They did not have any other means of travel also during the Esther years. So they used to walk all around the world. It was possible because during the Esther years, people were the sannyasis were also very healthy. So they could do that. Nowadays in Kali Yuga, of course, it may not be possible because the conditions have deteriorated. So then it says that a person in the renounced order of life may try to avoid even a dress to cover himself. If he wears anything at all, he should be wearing only a loin cloth. And when there is no necessity, a sannyasi should not accept even a danda. So normally those days, the sannyasis used to wear only a kopin if it was required. So as conditions have changed, now we might see sannyasis wearing clothes. It's not a problem. But the point is that one should not be, one should live in such a way to keep his body and soul together in that stage of life. Of course, it's applicable for everyone. But this stage of sannyasi is such that one should not depend on material necessities to sustain his life. Also, it is mentioned that sannyasi did not even accept a danda. A sannyasi should avoid carrying anything but a danda and kamandalu, means one who is completely satisfied in the self. Of course, in ISKCON, danda is carried these days by some sannyasis, but generally sannyasis carry a danda and kamandalu if required. The sannyasi completely satisfied should live on alms begged from door to door. So they are not supposed to, they are supposed to collect alms by begging. So this is how they used to live. Why? Because he should all, and they are not dependent on any person or any place. They should go door to door begging, but they are not dependent on any, but they are fully dependent on the Supreme Lord. And they should always be a friendly well-wisher to all the living beings. That means they are friendly to not only human beings, but all the living beings. And they should live a very peaceful and be a devotee of Krishna. In this way, one should move from one place to the another. So moving means they are not attached to one place. Then it says the sannyasi should always try to see the Supreme Personality pervading into everything and see everything, including the universe, as the Supreme. That means it's a total surrender, whereby they see the Lord as the means of sustenance for everything, and they see the Lord in everyone and everything. Then it is mentioned that during consciousness and unconsciousness, and between the two, we should try to understand the self and be fully situated in the self. That means there are times when somebody may be conscious, there may be some times when somebody is unconscious. For example, at the time of sleep, one may not be fully conscious. But between these two, one should try to understand that one is a real self. The real self is the Atma that is situated in the body, the soul which is there in the body. We are not this body. So in this way, we should realize that the conditioned and liberated stages are only illusory and not actually factual. That means a sannyasi surpasses all these stages of conditioned and liberated states of living. So he is beyond all this. With such an understanding, he should see only the absolute truth pervading everywhere. So ultimately, a sannyasi is a renounced person who sees only the Supreme Lord in everyone and everything. Further, it is mentioned that since the material body is sure to be vanquished and the duration of one's life is not fixed, neither death nor life is to be praised. That means one should not praise whether life or death, because everything is in the hands of the Supreme Lord. Rather, one should observe the eternal time factor in which everything manifests and disappears. So we have discussed before about the time. As time, the Lord creates, time is a representation of Krishna. As time he creates, and as time he annihilates also. So one should observe the activities of time, which is the cause of birth and death. So we also appear in this material world due to the time factor, and we also live due to the time factor. And even during our living, the time passes every moment, every second it passes. So before the creation of the present millennium, the living entities were under the influence of time, and after leaving also, they will be under the influence of time. Another important point that is mentioned is that about the literature. Any literature without spiritual benefit should be rejected. That means one should take shelter of the literature by which one is benefited in Krishna consciousness, or one can advance in Krishna consciousness. Other than that, any literature that does not give knowledge of the Lord should be rejected. So this is an important point. Another important point that is mentioned is that one should not become a professional teacher as a means of earning one's livelihood. So we might see many times these days, many people come and give katha and they use it as a means for their sustenance. Uh, Something may be given in a donation or as a charity, but preachers should not demand. So this type of professional teaching should be rejected. Nor one should indulge in arguments and in counter argument. Therefore, that means one should not engage in arguments and counter argument. One should be silent, which is what this today's sloka also mentions. Nor should one take shelter of any cause or a faction. That means a sannyasi should not, there might be many groups, but one should not take shelter of, once again, there's somebody disturbing, once again. Hello, आवाज मत करना, नाच चल रहा है. So one should not take shelter of any group. There might be multiple groups, but one should not take shelter of any group. Also, a sannyasi must not present allurements of material benefits to gather many disciples. That means many times people go to sannyasi for blessing, and then a sannyasi should not give them some sort of a material allurement to make disciples. There may be a tendency amongst many preachers who want to make disciples. So the disciples are sent by the Lord for their spiritual advancement. So with that, a sannyasi should not be eager to gather disciples. Then it is mentioned that nor should he unnecessarily read many books or give discourses as a means of livelihood. That means if we read too much of literature, then one might get confused and bewildered. So that is why it is said that one should read only books given in the Sampradaya by the Acharyas, recognized books. Srila Prabhupada always mentioned that we should read Bhagavad Gita as many times as possible and then gradually progress towards reading Srimad Bhagavatam, then to Chaitanya Charitamrita and so forth. So in each and every Sampradaya, they have their own system of following, but one point is that one should read books that are authorized within the Sampradaya, but one should not read many books which might be confusing. Then it is mentioned that he must never attempt to increase material opulences unnecessarily. So many times the sannyasis might go out and preach and people might give them in charity, but one should not become attached to increasing one's material opulences unnecessarily. Then there is a mention that a peaceful, equipoised person who is actually advanced in spiritual consciousness does not need to accept the symbols of a sannyasi as Tridanda or Kamandalu. That means in the previous years, the sannyasis used to carry a danda and a kamandalu. But one who is really advanced spiritually need not necessarily carry these things. But Srila Prabhupada mentions that according to necessity, he may sometimes accept these and sometimes reject them. There is, for example, in today's situation, there are many countries where even traveling in a sannyasi dress may not be permitted. So I remember there are many sannyasis who used to travel to the Gulf. They used to travel in civilian clothes. Now, it is not that they are wearing a civilian clothes, they are not renounced, but depending on time, place, and circumstances and situation, they adopt a means. But the ultimate motive of all this is to go and preach Krishna consciousness. Then there is mentioned that for Paramahamsas or sannyasis in the Vaishnava order, that means in our order, preaching is the first duty. So just accepting a sannyasi dress is not enough, but the ultimate purpose of being a sannyasi, to take up that renounced order, is to preach Krishna consciousness. So that is why they travel all around preaching the message of Lord Krishna. So it's mentioned that generally the Vaishnava sannyasis, being Paramahamsas, are automatically called Babajis, and they do not carry a kamandalu or a danda. But such a sannyasi is free to accept or reject the marks of sannyasa. So the danda and kamandalu are not necessarily compulsory for one for a sannyasi in our movement. And then the thoughts of a sannyasi is only thought is where is there an opportunity to spread Krishna consciousness. So a sannyasi should look at every moment, every avenue for preaching the message of Krishna consciousness. Srila Prabhupada also mentions that sometimes the Krishna conscious movement sends its representative sannyasis to foreign countries where the danda and kamandalu are not very much appreciated. So these are things, marks or symbols that are not very much appreciated in the foreign countries. So it is not necessarily or compulsory for us. Srila Prabhupada also mentions, we send our preachers in ordinary dress to introduce our books and philosophy. So and whatever order may be, that includes the sannyasi, the only they are go with the mission of introducing our books and philosophy. Srila Prabhupada also says that our only concern is to attract people to Krishna consciousness. And we may do this in the dress of a sannyasi or in the dress of a gentleman also. So there may be countries where sannyasi dress may not be permitted, but irrespective of the dress, our only objective is to spread Krishna consciousness. In the Srimad Bhagavatam 11th canto also, there is a mention of how sannyasi should be there. It's almost the same, but one or two extra points are there. One should develop complete detachment from attaining residence on different planets up to even Brahmaloka. So one should not even aspire for getting a residence in the higher planets, but they should be detached from residence in any place, any situation. Such wishes for material elevation are due to desire for fruits of material activity. But when one recognizes that endeavors to achieve residence on the higher planets ultimately avoid only suffering, then it is enjoined that one should take to that sannyasa in a spirit of renunciation. That means one should not even aspire that by performing my sannyasa duty in the ashram, one can get elevated to the higher planet, but rather one should renounce that spirit. Then there's a mention that the process of accepting sannyas involves worshipping the Lord with sacrifice, giving everything one possesses in charity to the priest, and establishing within one's own heart the various sacrificial fire. That means, if we see earlier, I had mentioned that one should not offer sacrifices, but in this point, it is mentioned that a sannyasi should perform these sacrifices within one's heart. Of course, we might find that in our movement during the time of initiation, they perform fire sacrifice, but that is permitted because it is all for a higher purpose, higher cause. Then it is mentioned that for a sannyasi, association with women or even the sight of women is more undesirable than taking poison. That means at that order, nobody should associate or even have a desire to associate with women. Excepting in emergencies, the sannyasi should never wear more clothing than a loincloth or simple covering over his loincloth. So that means, of course, it's not practically applicable today, but the point is that one should not wear a dress to become attached to that dress or to attract others also. Giving up all violence to living creatures, he should be subdued in the functions of body, mind, and speech. That means at the level of renunciation, one should have control over his body, his mind, and speech. It's said manasa vacha karmana. At the same time, one should not become violent to any living entities. Then there is first mentioned that one should remain and become detached and fixed on the self and travel alone to such pure places such as mountains, rivers, and forests. So the practice was that they travel alone. Thus engaged, he should remember the personality of Godhead and dwell in a place that is fearless and not heavily populated. I mean, those days, sannyasis used to go to mountains and forests and all. These days, this is not practically applicable. But the point is that one should not become contaminated by the city life. He should take his alms each day at homes chosen at random from those of the members of the 4 social classes, avoiding only the homes of those who are cursed and fallen. That means the sannyasi should beg his alms at selected homes which are not cursed or fallen. Sannyasi can beg alms from the other 3 ashramas. Brahmachari, of course, brahmacharis don't have any source of sustenance, but grihastha and vanaprasthas, they can beg alms. But one should be very careful not to choose the house which are cursed or they are fallen. Many times we might see even those in the higher order of life, like brahmanas, they might be fallen. So one should be very careful. Then it is mentioned that with a pure heart, he should offer to the personality of Godhead whatever food he has collected and take the Mahaprasadam remnants. That means even when sannyasis beg and if they get some alms, they should offer that to the Supreme Lord and take that as remnants or Mahaprasad. In this way, we should always be mindful that hankering for sense gratification is bondage and that engaging the objects of the senses in the service of Lord Madhava is liberation. So one should be very careful even partaking the Mahaprasada, because it should not be a means for sense gratification. Another important point mentioned is that if one lacks knowledge and renunciation or continues to be troubled by the unconquered 6 enemies headed by lust and all, power of senses, if one accepts the Tridanda renounced order simply for the purpose of carrying out a livelihood, then he will achieve a result only like the killing of his own self, one's own soul. That means if one accepts a renounced order of life, but just for the purpose of carrying out a livelihood, then it is as good as killing one's own soul. The point is that one should not have even least attachment to any means of sense gratification. Another important point that is mentioned is that a Paramahamsa is not under the control of injunctions and prohibitions. He is a devotee of the Lord, detached from external sense gratification and completely free from desire for even such subtle gratificatory goals as liberation. That means a sannyasi is free from even a desire for liberation. He is expert in discrimination and just like a simple child is free from concepts of pride and insult. That means a sannyasi should not be disturbed even by pride or even if by insult. One can get insulted by many. We see in the case of Jadabharata, when he was taking the palanquin, the king Raghugana chastised him, but he was not disturbed. So one in the renounced order of life is not disturbed by others' insults or unwanted situations. Although competent, he wanders about like a dull person, and although most learned, he engages himself like an insane fool in a coherent speech. This is the example of Jadabharata I gave. So that a sannyasi shows himself to be very dull, but at the same time, though he is learned, he behaves like a fool in his speech. Then, although actually fixed in the Vedas, he behaves in an unordered fashion. He tolerates the evil words of others and never shows contempt for anyone. So those, even if sometimes someone may use abusive words or unwanted words, he never shows contempt for them. Then he avoids acting as an enemy or vainly indulging in argument. A sannyasi does not engage himself in any type of argument, nor is he treating anyone as one's enemy. He sees the Supreme Personality of Godhead in all the creatures, and he sees that all living beings are within the personality of Godhead. So even if some disturbing situations come, a renounced person always looks at them as a, due to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Then another point that is mentioned here is, in order to keep his body alive for performing worship of the Lord. That means a renounced person accepts his body only for worship of the Lord, and in the process, he accepts whatever excellent or inferior food. Sometimes one might get excellent food, sometimes he might not get anything, he might get inferior food, but he accepts them only for worship of the Lord. Also, clothing and bedding, he used them without any endeavor. So that is why sannyasi is not does not endeavor for even for a bed. Whatever comes on his own, he takes it. Then it's also mentioned that although he has to make some effort to find food for maintaining his body, he does not become joyful when he finds something, and nor does he become depressed when not finding anything. That means sometimes one might get opulent food, but one does not become joyful. And at other times one may not get anything, so one does not get depressed. So the Supreme Lord himself, skip this. So a sannyasi is beyond all the dualities of this material world. Then another important point is that is mentioned in this sloka is how Karda Muni traveled all around to take shelter of the Supreme Lord. Ultimately, the point of all these activities or all these processes is to take shelter of the Supreme Lord totally. Because if we depend on anything that is material, then we depend on that and we try to sustain, and our goal is only to achieve that material opulence and material happiness. But in the renounced order, since one becomes detached from all that is material, he takes fully shelter of the Supreme Lord, because only the Lord is the shelter for everyone and no one else. In fact, in the 8th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, there's a very nice sloka in the Gajendra's prayers, where when the elephant was stuck, he is offering nice prayers. He says, the other elephants who are my relatives and friends could not rescue me from this danger. What to speak of my wives? That means when Gajendra was in danger, all the others left him. So he says, what to speak of my wives? Everyone, they left. Then in the prayers, he says, they cannot do anything. It is by the will of the providence that I have been attacked by a crocodile, and therefore I shall seek shelter of the personality of Godhead, who is the shelter of everyone, even of great personalities. That means the Lord is the shelter of all the living entities and all the great personalities. In the 8th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, there is a mention as to how even the demigods, they prayed to the Supreme Lord for his shelter, where Lord Brahma says, I, Lord Shiva, then Lord Shiva, and all the demigods, the demons, the living entities born of perspiration, the living beings born of eggs, the trees and plants sprouting from the earth, and the living entities born from embryos, all come from the Supreme Lord, from the 3 modes of material nature. Let us therefore go to the Supreme Lord and take shelter of his lotus feet. So all the living beings are born from the Supreme Lord, and the Lord is the only shelter. There is a nice example. One time when Srila Prabhupada was walking in the streets of Calcutta, suddenly, all of a sudden, he saw airplanes dropping bombs in the street. So there was a disciple of Srila Prabhupada. He asked Srila Prabhupada, what would you do when you see bombs being dropped from an airplane? Srila Prabhupada replied, yes, I would think that it is a Krishna in the form of a bomb. So Prabhupada was so advanced that he thought that Krishna has come in the form of bombs. So the point is that Lord Krishna is the shelter and he gives protection to everybody. There is another nice example that is given in Srimad Bhagavatam, where it is said that Queen Kunti's position vis-a-vis compared to Mother Devaki is given. In the case of Mother Devaki, Vasudeva was alive, whereas in the case of Queen Kunti, she was alone because her husband died. She had no other shelter other than the Lord himself. So all her relatives, all her children, they took shelter of the Lord. The Pandavas took shelter of the Lord up to the end because they knew that Lord is the only shelter. Whereas in the case of Mother Devaki, she lost her first few children, and whereas in the case of Queen Kunti, her children were sent into so many difficult situations, like putting them in a vast house, or attempts were made in so many places to kill them. But they all survived because they all took shelter of Krishna. In this verse, there is also a mention of how Kardamuni took a vow of silence. Now, silence means it is not that one just keeps quiet mum. No, actually the definition is given. One becomes silent so that people will not disturb him. If you talk, then the other person talks. There's a quote by Chanakya Pandita given that a rascal appears very intelligent as long as he does not speak. But speaking is a test. That means a person who is silent does not speak anything unwanted. And therefore it is said that one is called a Muni when he remains grave and does not talk nonsense. So one can talk, but one cannot talk nonsense. Example is given about Maharaja Ambrisha. Whenever he spoke about the pastimes of the Lord only. He didn't speak of anything else. So therefore, Mauna means refrains from nonsensical talk and engaging the talking facility only in talking the pastimes of the Lord. In the Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhagavad Gita, there is a mention. Silence means one is always thinking of self-realization. That means one should always be engaged in hearing and chanting of the Lord. The person in Krishna consciousness observes perfect silence in this sense. That means one who is fully engaged in this Krishna consciousness, even though he may be speaking, he is actually perfectly silent. There is another mention in the case of Maharaja Ambrisha, where it says that quote says, silence means only talking about Krishna Katha. So the quote is that Maharaja Ambrisha always fixed his mind on the lotus of feet of the Lord and talked of him only. So this is a quote from 9th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. We should also take this opportunity in life to become as good as a great saint simply by not talking unnecessarily with unwanted persons. That means we should take this as an example and we should not talk unnecessarily with unwanted persons. In the course of our day-to-day dealings, we might come across so many people. We should try to avoid association with unwanted people and also indulge in unwanted talking. Srila Prabhupada mentioned we should either talk of Krishna or chant Hare Krishna undeviatingly. This is Muni Vrata. That means this is the vow of a Muni or a silent person. Or in other words, this is the vow of a person practicing Krishna consciousness. They avoid anything that is not favorable to Krishna consciousness. In the vow, there is a mention as to how one should not hanker for any personal respect and become proud of one's material position. That means whatever Krishna consciousness we practice, it should be devoid of personal respect and we should not be proud of one's material position. Another important quality that is mentioned of a person in the renounced order is ahimsa. One should not be violent to other living entities. And the fourth canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, there is a quote which says, a candidate for spiritual advancement must be non-violent, must follow in the footsteps of great acharyas, must always remember the nectar of the pastimes of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, must follow the regulative principles without material desire, and while following the regulative principles should not blaspheme others. That means one who wants to progress in spiritual path he must be non-violent. He should not be violent to any living entity. What to talk about human beings, plants, trees, and everyone. He must follow in the footsteps of the great acharyas. Must follow the nectar of the and remember the pastimes of the nectar of the pastimes of the personality of Godhead. Then must follow the regulative principles without material desire. And finally, while observing these regulative principles, one should not blaspheme others. One should not blaspheme others means Sri Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur actually quoted, one should not find fault with any living entities because all are created by the Lord. A devotee should lead a very simple life and not be disturbed by the duality of opposing elements. That means anyone who is practicing devotion service should lead a very simple life. Srila Prabhupada always said simple living, high thinking, and one should not be disturbed by the duality of opposing elements like cold and hot. So all these are duality, and one should not be disturbed by this. And finally, in the sloka, it says one should learn to tolerate them. So a sadhu is one, he will definitely come across. We may not be able to tolerate it, but a person in the renounced order should be able to tolerate this. Even if someone causes him an injury, he tolerates. He does not become become an enemy of him. And lastly, before concluding the class, there is a mention about 18 processes for perfection of knowledge and enunciation. This is a sloka in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 13, 8 to 12. Of course, there are many slokas in that. I'll read the translation. What are the processes, 18 processes for acquiring knowledge and perfection of perfection? Humility. One should become humble. Then pridelessness. One should not develop pride. Non-violence, which we already discussed. One should not be violent to others. Tolerant. One should be tolerant to all the disturbing situations. Simplicity, which I already mentioned. Then approaching a bona fide spiritual master. Lord tells in Bhagavad Gita itself to Arjuna to accept Tadvidhi Panipatena Pariprashnena Sevya. One should accept a spiritual master and render service and inquire from him. Then cleanliness, steadiness. One should be steady in his mind always. One should not be disturbed by disturbing situations. Then self-control, renunciation of the objects of sense gratification, absence of false ego. One should not develop any ego. We see many times that even when one takes up the path of Krishna consciousness, one might develop an ego, thinking that I'm a devotee of the Lord. One should not develop that. Then the perception of the evil of birth, death, old age, and disease. That means one should understand clearly what are the evils of the four cycles, that is birth, death, old age, and disease. Then detachment. One should be detached completely from the entire material things. Then freedom from entanglement with children, wife, home, and the rest. That means one should not become entangled in the affairs of the family and home, because they might create a lot of disturbance in the progress of Krishna consciousness. Then even-mindedness. One should be always steady, again evenly minded. One should not become too friendly at the same time. One should not become inimical to anyone. One should, even-minded. I mean, amid pleasant and unpleasant events, whether the event or situation is pleasant or unpleasant, one remains very steady. Constant and unalloyed devotion to me. That means one should be constantly devoted to the Supreme Lord. Aspiring to live in a solitary place, which is what this sloka mentions. One should try and be in a solitary place which does not create too much of disturbance. There might be places like clubs, etc., which might be very, very noisy and a lot of disturbance. So one should try to avoid such places. Then detachment from the general mass of people. That means one should avoid association with highly materialistic people except for preaching. Then accepting the importance of self-realization. One should understand that the human life is meant for self-realization. And finally, philosophical search for absolute truth. That means one should try to understand what is the philosophy behind searching the absolute truth, that is the Supreme Lord. And Lord says, all these I declare to be knowledge. And besides this, whatever there may be is ignorance. So these are the 18 principles for acquiring knowledge and perfection. So with this, I conclude the class for the day. Any of you have any questions and comments in today's class, can ask me for the next couple of minutes. Any questions? Any comments?
Thank you for the session, Prabhuji. Hare Krishna.
Yes, Prabhu. Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
Any questions? Dear devotees, you can ask questions.
I think there are no questions, no comments. Can I leave, Prabhu?
Yes, Prabhuji. Thank you, Prabhuji. Dandavat
Thank you
pranam.
very much, Prabhu. Thank you. Dandavat pranam. Granthrat Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Srila Prabhupada